everyone. This is me, Edel, hanging out with my best friend Jharna virtually for the first time in almost 5 months. And so we're coming to you with another video with an interesting topic called spiritual bypassing. And the topic was selected by Jharna this time. So off to you, Jharna.
So the reason I chose this particular topic is because I see it a lot in my line of work, especially because I teach yoga, and I come across a lot of people who ask me questions related to, God and religion and spirituality, and they have different ideas about what it should be and how a lot of people that I have seen want to sort of escape their situation and try to get to a place of enlightenment and calm and without actually going through the emotions that they're feeling. And I thought it was a very relevant topic to talk about, especially with the lockdown everywhere. Everybody's reaching out to a higher power, more so than ever, I feel. And I thought it would be a good topic to explore for this particular reason. So that's the reason I came up with the topic.
Yes. Okay.
So, spiritual bypassing, right? What I understand from this is basically like what I explained, how we try to get to a place of calm and being very collected and trying to take part in activities that make us feel amazing at some level, but at the same time, we're sort of avoiding the conflict that we may be feeling on the inside. And I feel this is very common in most families, I think. I mean, what was it like for you growing up? Because I know when you were growing up, you had to deal with a lot of this. It's not something that I have personally been through on a big scale, but I know you have because you told me a lot of stories, which frankly, I don't know how to relate to it, but I think a lot of people will be able to relate to your experience. So, what was it like for you?
I don't know whether it was spiritual bypassing or gaslighting in the name of religion.
Hmm.
Um, Almost using God literally
Hmm.
as a tool of discipline
Yeah.
and not even like discipline in the purest sense of the word, but the dark side of discipline. And because I think my parents really didn't know the difference between fear
Hmm.
and respect. Like if a child feared you, that was good enough for them,
Hmm.
rather than me choosing to respect. So they used God if I put like just like a little bit of waste on the plate, and then they would be like, what would Jesus think? So I grew up with an idea of a God holding a magnifying mirror to a tiny little ant, which is me, and just like running away, and God is holding this magnifying mirror, just waiting to burn me in hell. And how I managed to grow up and not be completely nuts is truly beyond me. It's truly beyond me.
And I think for you to get to that point, you should have at some point stopped that narrative at some point and then start to do the work yourself, right? So,
I don't know, Jarna. I think I'll need a lot more growing up, a lot more distance from my childhood,
hmm,
probably from a mother myself. I don't know. Lots of things need to happen before I can understand what happened to me in my own childhood.
right.
Currently, it's a mystery how I'm not wearing a straight jacket and living inside a padded cell. I just don't know. Or I didn't swing to the absolute other end and become like a raging atheist.
Hmm.
So it's good to know that I'm not living a reactionary life, that I've absorbed those things into me and integrated that. And that I think a lot of good friendships, good conversations with you, my other friends, have truly played a huge role. What about what was it like growing in a family where God wasn't the central theme?
I think until maybe 2017 to 2015 to 17, it was more like I was trying to understand what God was, because up until 2015, I was an agnostic. I
Yeah,
was fenced, and I I didn't really know. And I think in 2015, when we did our teacher training, it was my entire foundation was so shaky, because I didn't have a foundation to base any of my understanding of what we learned during our teacher training, for those 6 7 months. And then once I started reading, um, like whatever we used to study in our teacher training classes, I had a lot of questions, and I just I didn't know what to make of it at all. And that's when my spiritual bypassing actually started, because I was going through a rough time in my life personally. And I used to use the scriptures that I read as a form of solace, um, to avoid looking at what I was actually going through. So
bad thing.
I'm
Was
sorry,
that a bad thing?
it was not the healthiest way to go about dealing with a problem. I
The,
can see that now.
the truth is, you didn't know any other way, Janna.
I didn't know any other way. I'm not saying that I regret what happened. I'm just talking about about what my journey was. And I have a lot of compassion for the person I was back then who didn't know any better. Because I mean, I wasn't in a good place, and I used spirituality, I used God, I used scriptures as a sort of a balm to a wound that was already festering, instead of actually letting that wound heal. I was just sort of, going over it without really getting to the deeper issues. So I used to remember, so there's something called the Yoga Sutras. It's supposed to be these 195 coded, like sutras, which was written down by Maharshi Patanjali. And when I used to read the interpretation of what the sutras was, in my head, I used to have this vision of what I wanted my life to be. And that was being a really calm and peaceful person, no matter how much uh, was falling apart around me. And instead of actually looking at why things were falling apart, I would just cling on to these sayings and read about it and imagine a version of what my life would be like. And I used to even think maybe the stuff that I'm going through now, it's not going to get any better. So let me just cling to this. Um, Now, when I look back, I have a lot of compassion for myself, because now I know why I did what I did. And that's the reason why I'm able to see it in other people when they're in so much pain and they talk about, wanting to get rid of their problems. And I get it. It's not very pleasant. But I think a lot of people just get into that space of wanting to bypass their actual feelings, because spirituality can be very seductive, right? It can
Yes.
be this idea that you have it all together and everything else is going haywire, but you are the calm in the midst of the storm, or at least the idea that you are calm in the midst of the storm. um, it took me it took me a little while to sort of get out of that space, because I guess Steel Swan happened to me, and then she just kicked me out of that position where I didn't have a choice but to look at what I was going through. But there was no pressure from my family to believe in God or, you know, like I come from a very like not from an orthodox family. My family is not religious. I mean, sure, we visit temples and stuff, but it was never forced on me to be a part of anything that I didn't want to be a part of. And I guess they tried, and because I was agnostic and I just said I'm not interested, they didn't really force me to do something that didn't come naturally to me. But I guess after this 2 years of going through stuff that I didn't know I was going through, I think I found my way back to faith. But this time it's different. I don't discount what I'm actually going through and reach for something that's sort of imaginary. Maybe I don't know if that's the right word, but yeah, yeah. I think that's been my experience with spiritual bypass. So, I mean, the stuff that you went through was kind of big, right? You said maybe it was more like a gaslighting situation. It could have been. So, what was it like for you to just step back and reevaluate where you were?
I had to make do with what I had. So the Christ that was preached to me and taught to me by my parents as an instrument of control over me. Um, my first act of defiance was to see a Christ for myself, a God who was actually for me and not against me, who was
Mm,
actually willing to walk side by side and be with me. To make friends with God was my absolute first act of rebellion, I have to say.
mm,
And I had to keep that relationship with God, with Christ, secret from my family because they no longer now had the tool to hurt me with God, but they still managed many, many times over. But I was growing stronger in my own individual expression. And I think that happened because I made friends with people who were not just Catholics. I made friends with a lot of ecumenical, I joined a lot of ecumenical prayer groups, so I was able to talk to people who had a different experience of Christ. So I started reading the Bible by myself, started interpreting things, reading books where the interpretation of Christ was different. And I formed my own vision of what God could be rather than the frightening, authoritative, disciplining, autocratic demon that my parents invariably made me think God was. So that was my first act of rebellion. And once I started making friends with God and having a personal relationship with God, it made me understand that my parents' interpretation of Christ and how I understood their interpretation, there was two different levels of communication gap, how they interpreted God and how I interpreted their interpretation of God, how I understood it. So once that healthy gap was able to form between my mind and the mind that I inherited from my parents, um, I was slowly leaning so much on God because everything I saw in my life did not give me any pleasure because I was not, none of the conditions I lived in was conducive for me. Um, we cannot expect, like a cactus cannot grow in uh, a fertile soil where it rains every day. You can't find cactuses there. Cactuses have to grow in certain arid conditions, right? So I was put in a place where I was not meant to thrive, which means that it's my job to find a place where I can thrive, just like it is everybody's commission to. So the next job for me was I think I used God to justify where I was in life because I didn't know there could be anything different. So I used God as a balm. I used God to justify everything that was happening. I used God to garner meaning for the things because I had very low self-esteem. I had to have a spiritual meaning, like my stubbing my toe on the table's end couldn't just be my stubbing my toe. It had to have the universe was doing it to me. God was doing it to me. So in my head, because the smaller we are, the bigger the spiritual battles are, and the louder we talk about it. So the demon and Christ were always fighting around me throughout the day. I'm glad to say that I now understand my place in the universe, which is so freaking insignificant. And to get to this point, I had to go through, well, spiritual bypassing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I think spiritual bypassing, for me at least, was the most direct route to spirituality.
yeah.
Ironically, to me, it was. What about you? Was it?
It absolutely was, because after the bypassing happened, I switched to the other extreme where I started listening to what I was feeling. Because I think up until a few years ago, I was just burying my feelings and not addressing it head on. If I felt something, I would think it wasn't important enough. I mean, and again, I'm saying this with a lot of understanding for people who still do it, because I mean, healing is not fun, right? Um, but today I realize that healing is not fun. I mean, it can be, but most of the times it hasn't been in my experience. But I think the reason we stay put is because of familiarity, right? But once you get to the other side, it feels like healing may be painful, but it's definitely less painful than being stuck in a place where you don't want to be. And I think the first step to sort of stop bypassing what you're going, I mean, bypassing spiritually and looking at God as some entity far off who's sitting in a shop and handing out punishments and rewards is to actually address what you feel about a certain situation. If you get upset about something and you just say, yes, I'm upset, instead of saying, okay, I'm upset and God is making me feel this way, and God is responsible for my feelings. So I think the first step for me to stop doing that was to stop imagining that somebody else was in charge of my life, because it's such a powerless place to be. And for me, again, like you said, spiritual bypassing was the most direct way to get to the point where I didn't want to do it anymore. And I think the more I started observing myself and giving importance to what I was going through in this physical reality, um, I started finding my way back to, I think, just faith and God. And now I visit temples. I mean, because of COVID, I haven't, and in the last year, maybe not so much, but I visit temples very regularly now, which was just something I never did. I used to do it because people forced me to go to a temple because of some function or some ritual, and now I actually look forward to going to places of worship, because it's not about begging God to make my life better. It's just because I feel at home when I go to places of worship. So I think spiritual bypassing is like a rite of passage for everybody, I feel, before they get to the point where they don't really want to do it anymore. I'm completely with you on that. I am. And yeah, I get it. When people don't want to do it, I understand why. It's it's not fun. I get it. I completely get it. But yeah, the reason I wanted to talk about this is because I think a lot of people go through this, and I've especially heard this from you. I mean, what your experiences have been, and from what I've read. I've read like in Christianity, a lot of times this happens, is what I've read. Like if you come from a very strict Christian background, sometimes your interpretation of what God is could be very different unless you find your own interpretation for it. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that how it is?
I think it's true for any faith, to be honest. I think if we rely on another person's interpretation of anything, unless we've experienced and tasted it for ourselves, it's still second-hand, third-hand knowledge. And
Mm.
what is second-hand and third-hand knowledge is a theoretical life that we live, not a flesh and blood life we live. And sorry, that's Chaplin. So if we take that path of least resistance and allow someone else's belief system to harness us, then we are going to be, well, we're going to be victims all our lives. So I think anybody, any kind of belief system, if it is a secondhand atheism, secondhand Christianity, secondhand agnosticism, secondhand paganism. It can be anything. If it's not genuine, if it's not tasted and received and comes from our fiber, everything is going to be, we're going to be parrots, we're going to be puppets, and someone else's belief system, something that is outside of us, is going to be pulling our strings, and we're not going to be authentic. And the opposite of spiritual bypassing is actually authenticity. So inauthenticity be um, would be the rule of the day if it's not just Christianity, though I know mostly Christians who have done this to their children. I'm by far not the only person who's been brought up in this militant Catholic background. I know so many people who have. So yes, I do know lots of Christians, but I think secondhand any belief will lead us down to the path of inauthenticity and victimhood.
I think it's a very universal thing, right? Yeah, like I said, because in my line of work, I see it all the time. And most of the times I just tell them, you know what, come and practice, and try not to think too much. um, but but yeah, I think it's quite rampant um, in spiritual communities. Once you find a community where you have similar belief systems, or you find a group of people with similar belief systems, unless you're willing to look at the teachings objectively or interpret it in a way that feels right for you, it's very, very possible that your ideas about spirituality and the teachings of spirituality can be so different from what it needs to be for you. Like what you learn from a particular teacher or what you learn from a particular scripture can have different interpretations and meanings for a particular person. It's very subjective. So yeah, I've seen this a lot in my line of work. I'm very surprised, but actually not so surprised also. So yeah. So I guess, I mean, would you like to add anything else to this?
Um, what? Why should we not spiritually bypass? What is
Well,
so terrible? Like if let's say I'm spiritually, like let's say I'm caught in this horrible, like somebody I love is dying of cancer. My pet has just died. I've lost all my friends. Lost my job. And if I if I transcend the horribleness of the reality that I have through an escape, the only thing that I have in my arsenal is my belief in God. and I'm not sitting and soaking in the terribleness of the moment and feeling it. But because if I felt it right now, I would either go completely nuts, completely dysfunctional because it's overwhelming, the grief is overwhelming, and I cannot function in a productive way. So I use spirituality and I use God to function now till such a time as when I'd be able to feel. And that is not a terrible thing. In that way, I still spiritually bypass. I still do. And I'm going to. It's like the infatuation stage in a relationship. Falling in love does not have that flavor if there is not that initial honeymoon phase, right? So I think for the rest of my life, I hope to always spiritually bypass, because when something horrible happens to me, in that moment, there is, I kind of like step back and see this thing happening to me. And I need, I don't want to face anything in my life alone. I genuinely don't. And I like thinking that I have a God who faces things with me. Um, and I'm going to continue to think that I face life with God. Like God has nothing better to do than to clear out the traffic for me so I can get to work on time because I started 5 minutes late from work, from home. Like, I'm sorry, but I'd love to live with that delusion. I'm not going to apologize for it. And I think everybody is guilty of that tiny little bit of sense of grandeur. And I'm always going to, like, if something bad happens, my initial first thought is, well, it's God's will. God has designed for this to happen, which is, in the grand scheme of things, it's still true, right? And then slowly, God gives me a small, tiny little breathing space. And also, when something horrible happens, God, spiritual bypassing, gives me a reason to be optimistic and wake up. I think, I'm sure God has a reason and a purpose. And invariably, things turn out in my favor. Is it a placebo, spiritual placebo effect? Probably it is. But why not? And why not use every arrow in our quiver, is how I feel. To me, spiritual bypassing is not a bad thing. I think it's a very immature thing. It is. And we are all immature because we all have an inner child. And that inner child needs access to spirituality as well. And if it is through spiritual bypassing, why not? And I'm not above spiritual bypassing. And I hope, I hope, whatever it takes, whatever it takes. So yeah, that's my thought on it.
And I also feel that, like you said, right? Because that's just something we do. You know, when something horrible happens, there's also a tendency to sort of split and watch that horrible thing happen,
Yeah.
like it happened to somebody else. It also, yeah, I think it also gives you a little bit of space to make mistakes, give that little bit of buffer for things to not go exactly according to plan. Like a lot of things go according to plan. But yeah, I think it also gives you a sense of where you are, what your capabilities are, what your limitations are, and there are certain things that are just not meant to be in your control when you let some higher power just sort of take over and then rearrange your entire life, and then somehow it just turns out to be much better than what you thought it would be, right? uh,
Yes.
so yeah, I mean, it's not a bad thing at all, and sometimes you need that buffer to, for once, not take responsibility for your life, because I mean, we all create our own realities, um, but at least for those few fleeting moments, we can let, we can just say, oh, you know what, God decided to do this. So I'm not going to be in the driver's seat anymore. I think because of that, we do need that little bit of buffer. Yeah, I agree.
There are a lot of nefarious people, though, who can use this need for spiritual bypassing. Because when we are spiritually bypassing, if we do it deliberately, consciously, and understanding that we're doing it within ourselves, I think that is completely different from multitudes of vulnerable people. Let's say lots of people who've been disenfranchised by a loss of jobs during the pandemic, and suddenly a preacher or a self-help guru or a psychologist or a politician or somebody comes in and gives them the exact right, socio-economic, spiritual, psychological answer to something, and then gives them this spiritual key that only he holds, and he can open the door and lead them on to a better life. That would make us very vulnerable. That is, I think both of us are very fortunate because we are standing on the side of the bank, um, which is safe. There could have been so many wrong things that could have happened to me as I look back on my life, where I could have fallen prey to a lot of cultish teachings, to a lot of people who could have very easily used my naivete and my eagerness to believe that I was being used by God in some strange and magnificent and mysterious way, because my sense of self was so small. So my belief in God was like, I was like this, and my belief in God was like that. That's the only way I could magnify like this huge God to interest in this tiny me. So I must be so special. Not that God is special, but I am so special. So that's how it's very, and also because birds of a feather will flock together. If that is my experience, it's so easy to attract people of a similar vernacular, of a similar mindset. And when a bunch of people gather with a similar mind, you can create an aura around them, a force field around them that will multiply the sense of spiritual bypassing, of putting everything onto God, into the spirit world, into the universe, into this unknown, things that we can do by ourselves, take responsibility for our lives and make better choices, learn new methods, learn how to follow and bend the laws of nature to our benefit. We become very passive, except that we will talk a lot if we gather into that cults and those groups. And I genuinely don't know how I escaped that. Like I said, I need to grow very old, and my past needs to become like a tiny speck, in the rearview mirror, so I could have a global view of what went on, and then I'll know how I escaped so many minefields.
I think you might get to see it because you're going to live to be 3,000. So
Yes, absolutely. I'll see my past, everybody's past. I'll be like this living history. Yes.
and there are so many cults around the world that still have this sort of culture, right? I mean, there have been documentaries made about cults like this.
Oh
So
God.
it's
Yeah.
still very, very, very much around. It's not something that's going to go away anytime soon, which now makes me realize that there's a lot of like pain and grief in the world that people are trying to run away from, and they're using this as a sort of a haven to feel a little bit better about themselves and feel a little bit more control, like in control of their lives.
It
So yeah.
is nature, after all, to seek for relief. And in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you don't go to another hierarchy until the other one is supplied for, right? So if I'm hungry and you want to come and talk to me about changing the world, I'm not going to listen. Feed me first. So I think a lot of people, um, we need to meet our needs. And if I choose to meet my need through spirituality, through positive thinking, through imagining myself to be somebody else, to get to another day, which is 24 hours further from the point of trauma, then I think I should use it. I should use it. There are lots of people who unfortunately use drugs, like as in real drugs. Then there are people who get into a very hedonistic lifestyle. Then there are people who, I don't know, commit suicide, which I think is the ultimate spiritual bypass, where you are like, I'm done with reality as we know it. I'm exiting from this plane, and I don't even know what that level is. So everything is spiritual bypass, where we try to explain off that which we can see, touch, smell, and taste, and feel, and quantify with something spiritual. And we shouldn't be so harsh on ourselves, because we did whatever we needed to do to survive. I hope I'm never harsh on another human being who's doing it as well, and belittle their faith, which is probably the only thing that's making them, hold on to reality. Um, but more than anything else, I hope that we never stay in that honeymoon infatuation stage, that we build the muscles to engage in life. Yeah.
You need to do some heavy lifting at some point. Yeah. So yeah, I think I've covered it from my side, whatever I wanted to learn about spiritual bypassing. And yeah, I mean, whoever's going through this, like you said, I hope there will come a time when they feel a little more brave to try something that they've never done before. Um, Maybe find people who are willing to support you, or find a therapist who's willing to support you and walk you through this. So I hope um, everybody finds that space where they feel safe enough to explore whatever it is that they're going through, without finding roundabout ways. But again, at their own time, not by forcing yourself to do something that doesn't feel right. Yeah.
Thank you, Jharna, for a wonderful topic and an illuminating conversation. And thank you, dear viewer, for joining Jharna and me for this edition of Shred Your Halo. It's always a pleasure to talk with our virtual audience. And please let us know what you think. Please leave a comment below. Please click like if you like this video. And just to remind you, we put out a video once every 2 weeks on a Friday. Join us then for next fortnight's topic, where we'll be dealing with something a little lighter, and just to buffer two terribly serious subjects. We do that because we're sneaky like that. So thank you so much for joining us. Please click like, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with anyone who's near and dear. And if you have a thought, please leave a comment down below. And we hope to see you next fortnight. So it's ciao, bye from Edel and Jharna. Bye.
Bye.